Hey guys, it's Steve with Prima Coffee. Today we're going to take a look at how to replace the burrs in your Mazzer ZM grinder. One of the cool things about the ZM is that there are a few different burr sets available. They're all 83mm flat burrs, pretty much just like the Mazzer Major, the espresso grinder. So you're able to put different burr sets in here depending on what you want to use it for. There are two different sets for filter coffee grinding. They're kind of different cutting patterns, so they get slightly different particle uniformity yields. And then there's a couple different sets for espresso, as well as, so the standard burrs are all just steel. You also have titanium coated steel burrs available as well, which will have longer life, better sharpness out of the gate. And again, they'll just kind of be a little bit more durable. So assuming you do want to switch, in this case I actually already have espresso burrs installed here and I want to switch it over to filter grinding. We're going to take a look at kind of how that process works, how to make the switch, and what the ZM does that's a little bit different from other grinders, which will come toward the end. First thing that we need to do, of course, is just turn off the grinder and unplug it for safety. From there, I'm going to open up the front panel just by twisting it off to the right. And then I have 3 slotted screws that I need to remove. So I've got a nice big chunky slotted screwdriver here. What I'm removing now is the stationary Burr Carrier. So it's just a big piece of aluminum where the stationary burr is mounted. It also has the sort of chute coming down from the hopper, so you'll be able to see that when I get this out. But basically it's just one big piece of aluminum with the burr itself screwed to it. Pretty easy to remove. We just have 3 screws. And it's a nice snug fit too, so you don't need to worry too much about like it falling out on you or anything like that. Again, it's just 3 simple screws. There are a couple of tools that you might want for this job. Here is the Burr Carrier itself. You'll see my stationary burr here. We have this chute and kind of like an elbow that actually feeds the beans from the hopper down into the burrs. So this is where most of your cutting actually happens, right in line with this chute down into either your spout or your dosing cup, whatever you have installed. I've already taken the liberty to do a little bit of cleaning here. So what you might want to use is like a microfiber cloth, a couple of brushes, maybe even a vacuum cleaner if you have one handy. When you're reinstalling a fresh set of burrs, you want everything to be as clean as possible. You want it to be as free of grounds as you can get it. Any little bits of debris that might get stuck under the burrs are going to affect your particle uniformity and your grind performance. So you want everything to be really nice and clean. So that's why I've got some brushes and a cloth here. Of course, I also have my other set of burrs. These are the model number 151F. So these are the filter burrs that come with the ZM. I'm going to be putting those back in, replacing the espresso, the B burrs that I have in there. So I'll need to clean these burrs off, clean everything up nice and good before I get everything screwed in. To remove this burr, pretty simple. You can use a slotted or a Phillips screwdriver. Again, we just have 3 screws, so you just need to get those out and the burr will come right off. Really, really quick and simple to get it removed. When we are reinstalling burrs, we want to make sure that we're taking alignment into consideration. If you over tighten one screw, you might cause the burr to warp just slightly, and just slightly is just enough to throw off your grind performance when we're talking about, a range of like microns and stuff for most of our coffee grinding. For like French press or something like that, if you're taking it into the really coarse range, it's probably not a huge concern, but especially with espresso, a few microns here and there can actually have a pretty big impact on your grind quality. Again, I'm just kind of making sure that everything's nice and clean. I'm brushing off my surfaces and I'm wiping them down with this microfiber cloth just to prepare for installing that burr in a moment. Now I've removed my stationary burr. That's all done, really easy. What's less easy is this rotating burr that's attached to the burr mountain here. If you have a socket driver, you can take this off. You can take out the whole Burr Carrier. I'm actually going to do it sort of the hard way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take off all these accessories, including the hopper, and I'm going to set the grinder on its back so I have a nice stable surface to access that burr. And it's a heavy grinder, so just tipping it carefully onto its back. And it's pretty stable here as is. All I need to do now is, just like before, remove 3 screws down in here and then pull that burr out. So now that I've got all 3 screws out of this rotating burr, it is a pretty tight fit in there, so I'm just going to use a slotted screwdriver to kind of wiggle the burr and sort of prise it up. Just working along the outside to kind of loosen it because it's been there for a little bit. And you can see, like, with just a little bit of force, it'll start to move, and then I can get my fingers in there and pull it out. It takes a little tiny bit of wiggling, and it'll come free. So there we have it. All right, so we've got the old burrs taken out. We've also got everything nice and clean. You know, I've brushed it, I've wiped it down with my cloth. I've got real good clean surfaces to put these new burrs on. Burrs themselves are also nice and clean. Again, you want to make sure really no grounds, no debris or anything on any of these surfaces because you want a good solid fit. So the installation process is basically just like taking out the burrs in reverse. I've got 3 screws per burr. You do not have to worry about which burr goes where. They are multifunctional basically. One could be stationary or rotating, it doesn't matter. They are designed specifically for this grinder, so you don't need to really worry about anything like that. One thing I am going to do though is I'm not going to fully tighten down any of these screws until all 3 are sort of somewhat snug. And again, that's because if I over tighten any of them, I can cause a little tiny bit of warping on the burr. So this is also my last chance to make sure that everything is nice and aligned. So I'm going to give it a good check. I might actually loosen some of these screws just so I can nudge the burr a tiny bit. I'm checking the alignment along the carrier. I'm making sure that there's like a fairly even gap around the outside of the burr. There's not much wiggle room, but there's just enough that when I go around, I want to make sure that that gap is even all the way around. That's mainly an alignment thing. You want to make sure that your burrs, your 2 burrs are properly aligned so they're, the cutting surfaces are matched up nicely. I'm switching over to a slotted screwdriver here for just the final little torque on these screws. So alignment is a slight concern, especially just making sure that everything's nicely centered inside this Burr Carrier and inside the rotating Burr Carrier in here. The process for the rotating Burr Carrier is just the same. Again, make sure everything's nice and clean. I don't have any debris here. So lining this up, again, is just as easy as getting those screw holes in place, making sure everything is nice and level, and then we'll drop our screws in, screw them down, and basically go through that same process. We're going to optically make sure that everything is nice and aligned within the Burr Carrier. We've got even spacing around all the edges, and that everything seems to be nicely situated, and the screws aren't getting over torqued on one side or another. So just kind of carefully going through that process, taking your time, making sure, again, everything's nice and clean, everything's nice and aligned. And that'll give you the best grind quality after making a burr swap. All right, so we've got both burrs installed now. The last thing that we have to do in terms of the actual sort of installation process is get the stationary Burr Carrier back in place, screwed in, and then we have one final step after that. So just to get us started, I'm going to lift my grinder back up. Got my stationary Burr Carrier here. It slides really easily into place, and then we have this sort of like cut off circle shape, which means that it really only goes in one way. You've only got to worry about aligning that straight edge with the straight edge and the fitting here. There's a little tiny bit of like radial play, and that's all you need to worry about in terms of lining these screw holes back up. It's really, there's not much actual play there. So it's pretty easy to get it all back in alignment. And then of course, just tighten down these screws. And that is our last step of the actual physical installation. Now, if you know the ZM, you know that it also requires a zeroing step after this. That is the first step to take after installing or swapping a set of burrs. You need to tell the grinder basically where the 0 point is between the two burrs that you've just installed, because it adjusts grind size based on the distance between the two burrs. It does that with a stepper motor that adjusts a certain distance in microns. So we've got our burrs installed. We have everything nice and closed up. All the screws are tightened and everything like that. I'm going to do just two final things before I plug my grinder back in and turn it on. I'm going to put the hopper back on just kind of as a safety precaution, but I also have to put a spout or cup back in place. The grinder will not let me adjust my zeroing point if that is not in place. From there, I'm going to get the grinder turned back on and we'll go through how to zero it. Okay, so the final step, again, we've got everything installed, all the screws are tightened, everything like that. The final step that I have to do is tell the grinder where the 0 point is for these new burrs. So I've plugged my grinder back in, I'm going to turn it back on, it'll boot right up. So from here I have to go into the service settings. So I'm going to operate my dial, just turn it once to highlight the hamburger menu or the settings menu if you like. Hit the button. We're going to scroll down to service, select that, and then we're going to go to replace burrs. Step one here. I just installed the filter standard burrs. That happens to be my first option, so I'm going to select those. You'll see that blink. You can tell it what date you like. I'm going to kind of give it a generic date. It doesn't matter for me. It'll save the date. Now, we're going to have set 0. To actually tell it the 0 point, I have to hold the start-stop button for about 2 seconds and then hit the select button on the knob. You'll hear the motor go through this zeroing process. It'll take a minute or two. What it's doing is it's moving that rotating Burr Carrier back and forth with a stepper motor. Once it feels resistance from the burrs hitting each other, and again, this is why it's crucial to have a clean grinding chamber. It'll hit those burrs, it'll say, okay, that seems to be my 0 point. It'll test it again a couple more times. Once it feels like, you know, it safely knows where the 0 point is between those burrs, it will set that as the 0 point in its calibration system. And from there, it will know, you know, if you tell it to set to 250 microns or what have you, whatever your desired grind setting is, it knows where that 0 point is between those burrs now, and it will set the motor accordingly. So it's really important to go through that zeroing process. It's fairly important to tell it what set of burrs you have. I believe that it actually has some memory in the system that says, oh, you know, these burrs are this sort of thickness. There might be some differences in thickness between the burrs, especially with the differences in cutting patterns. They're probably fairly subtle, but it's important to tell it what set of burrs you just put in. And again, obviously run through that zeroing process to make sure that your grind settings are correct. And that you're not damaging the burrs by running them too close together or something like that. So again, it just takes a couple minutes. This set 0 will continue to flash while it's doing it. Obviously you can hear the motor kind of going back and forth as it's adjusting itself. Once it tells you that it's done, you'll be able to navigate to the escape. Escape just brings you back to each subsequent level of menu. Just escape back through and you're ready to grind coffee. It's really that simple. Again, this is just a little tiny bit of an extra step in addition to most other grinders where you could just swap the burrs out and be good to go. Obviously, that's just because it uses an electronic grinds adjustment system. Really, it's not that complicated. It's just an extra step on top of reinstalling those burrs. So that is a burr replacement on the Mazzer ZM. Thanks so much for watching.